All right. We're going to continue in our Revelation series this morning. I've had a lot of interesting comments and a lot of questions about Revelation as we've gone through this series and even this week. And so I'm glad that you're engaged in this. I'm glad that you're studying this on your own and hearing a lot of good information and weeding out some bad information as you go through it, as you think about the end times. And we are living in the end times. Do you know that? We are living in that time when we're expecting God to send his son again. And so his return is imminent. That return is imminent. And that means this. It means that it's going to happen. We don't know when, but we know it's going to happen. And so as we've been reading about that, now we've reached all the way to Revelation chapter 12. And we're going to be reading the first 6 verses this morning. This is John's revelation. Remember, John is John the Apostle, John, one of the 12 disciples. He has been exiled on the island of Patmos, and he has been given this vision of great things that are to come. And as he continues, we're now on a point where we're going to read about signs that are going to come. We're going to read about 2 of those signs in these 6 verses. A great sign. That's the only one that's called a great sign in these signs. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in labor and agony as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. There was a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 crowns. Its tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she did give birth, it might devour her child. She gave birth to a son, a male, who is going to rule all nations with an iron rod. Her child was caught up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God to be nourished there for 1,260 days. Well, that's just clear as a bell, isn't it? Would anybody like to come up and just explain that for us? It's like a lot of revelation. There are a lot of questions that raises. And so what I want to do this morning, what I want to do is just sort of go through, and we're going to look at this woman. Who is the woman? Who is the dragon? Who is the sun? What does all this mean? Well, first of all, it says that it's a sign. And so it's telling us that these things are symbolic. If I'm talking with children about baptism, a lot of times I'll say, your baptism is like a sign or a symbol. And I'll say, do you know anything about signs and symbols? And, maybe I'm dealing with a 2nd grader or a 3rd grader. And I'll say, well, if I make a sign like this, what does that mean? They'll say, plus, that's a plus. Sometimes they'll say a T, but that's a plus. Well, what if I do this? Well, that's a minus. What if I do 2 of those? Well, that's equals. Well, what if you're riding down the road and you see a sign with 8 sides and it's red and you can't even read? What does that mean? Well, it means stop. And I'll say, well, your baptism is like a sign or a symbol of what's happened to you. You are going down the water. You're saying that I believe Jesus went down in the ground. You're coming out of the water. You're saying, without saying words, you're saying, I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And I believe that one day when I die, my life's not over, that I'm going to rise from the dead because Jesus did. It's a sign. That's what a sign is. That's what a symbol is. And John specifically says that he is looking at a great sign that happens in the heavens. And this sign in heaven represents some things that happen on the earth. So let's look at these characters, these people, these things that are represented in these signs. First of all, the woman in verses 1 and 2. The woman, I'm going to tell you, represents Israel. We'll get into why the woman represents Israel. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman, this woman is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. That might not jump out at you, but I'm going to read you some scripture in a minute that's going to make it clear who we're talking about there. Verse 2 says, she was pregnant, and she cried out in labor and agony as she was about to give birth. Something significant is about to happen to this woman. She's about to give birth. And everybody here has been born. Most people here have been around somebody who's been pregnant. You've been around somebody who gave birth. We had what I would call unnatural childbirth when my wife had our 4 children. Unnatural childbirth is when the father is there. And I was there. So I was there for all 4 of our children. Natural childbirth is the way my dad did it. He was in a waiting room. But we did unnatural childbirth. That meant that I was there. And so I understand that childbirth is hard. Like the whole process is hard, and it describes that. It describes this woman as in this sign as having a situation where she is crying out in labor. She is hurting. She is in labor. She's in agony as she's about to give birth. This is a special kind of birth. This is a sign, as I said, it's a vision in heaven that John is looking at in heaven, but it represents some things that are happening on earth. This woman is described as having the sun as her clothing and the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars. That should remind biblical scholars to go all the way, not to the last book of the Bible, but to the first book of the Bible. And that is in Genesis. In Genesis, in chapter 37, we are reading the story about Joseph. You remember Joseph and the coat of many colors, and you remember that Joseph was a special child, that God would use Joseph, and God would take care of his people who were in danger of famine, and that God would put Joseph in second in command in Egypt, and he would take care of his people, Israel. Remember that story? And in Genesis chapter 37, I'm going to read you verses 5 through 10, 7 through 9 are really kind of the key verses here, but just to give you a little context. Joseph had a dream. We know Joseph for having dreams. Joseph had a dream, this first dream we see about with Joseph. When he told it to his brothers, by the way, who was Joseph's dad? Joseph's dad was, somebody help me out here. Jacob, right? His dad was Jacob, also to be known as Israel. All right? And so Joseph is one of 12. That number's starting to ring a bell. We talked about 12 stars. 12 sons of Jacob are the 12 tribes of Israel. All right? Joseph is one of those sons. He's the son who is favored the most by his father. Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, that he had 11 of them, they hated him even more. They were already jealous of him. They were jealous of him because he had been given that coat of many colors. They were jealous of him because he was the favorite child. But now they're even more jealous because he tells them this dream. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I had. There we were, him and his brothers. We were binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly my sheaf stood up." Imagine all the 12 brothers there. Each one has a sheaf, a gathering of grain. "Suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves, the 11 of you, gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." Now, those 11 brothers get a bad rap, and rightfully so. Later on, they're going to take Joseph and throw him down a well, and they're going to sell him. They want to kill him, and they end up just selling him to some people, and God uses that plan to eventually put him as second in command in Egypt. It's an amazing story to read the story of Joseph. But his brothers don't like this. I'm going to submit to you that if you had brothers and sisters, and your brother or sister came up to you and said, "Hey, I had a dream, and in my dream you bowed down to me, you probably wouldn't have liked that either. So it's kind of a natural reaction, but it's part of what God is going to do to use Joseph in a mighty way. He says, your sheaves in my dream gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you really going to reign over us? His brothers asked him. So they understood. They understood that this was a dream in which he was more important than them. But he was going to be. He was going to be the one that was going to save them when he ended up in Egypt, second in command to the Pharaoh. Are you really going to reign over us, his brothers asked him? Are you really going to rule us? So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. And now we get to the symbolism. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Look, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon, ding, 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 ding. Back to Revelation. Sun, moon, stars. Remember this lady is described that way? I had another dream. This time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars, the 11 brothers, were bowing down to me. He told his father and brothers, and his father rebuked him. What kind of dream is this that you've had, he said. Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you? So who are the sun and the moon and the stars in that dream that Joseph had back in Genesis 37:11? Well, the sun would be Joseph's father, Jacob. The moon would be his mother, Rachel. And the 11 other stars would have been those 11 other brothers. Together, Joseph and those 11 brothers make up the 12 tribes of Israel. So now, when we read in Revelation chapter 12 that this woman is clothed in this way, she's clothed with the sun, Jacob. The moon is under her feet, Rachel. And a crown of 12 stars on her head. Those are the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. Clearly, this is a vision in heaven of something to do with the nation of Israel. In the Revelation vision, just like in the Genesis vision, that's what these things stand for. It's referring back to the sun and moon and stars. It's the nation of Israel. But which Israel? Which Israel? This is what gets complicated, and this is why it's difficult sometimes to interpret Revelation. What is meant by Israel? Well, Israel was Jacob, and that nation, Israel, is what came out of Jacob. It was the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham that he would become a great nation, even when he was 100 years old. And thought he and his wife were past child-producing years. God gave him that promise. Jacob, Israel, was the fulfillment of that promise along with his wife Rachel. They resulted in those 12 sons, those 12 tribes of Israel. And so we know that Israel refers to them in the Old Testament. It refers to the people of Israel, the Jewish people, the nation that comes from Abraham, that is the hand-chosen, hand-picked nation of God, whom he favors above the other nations. Not because they're great, but because he has chosen them. And so the other nations are to see this great nation that God has chosen, which is really the least among the nations. It's not the most powerful militarily. It's not the most impressive intellectually. It's not the richest nation. It's just a small nation, and God promises them land, and he promises them favor, and he takes care of them. And the other nations are to watch God's nation and say, their God is the real God. That's why he chose this nation, Israel, that is still being referred to now in Revelation. So we know there's that Israel. We know today there is the nation Israel that came back together in 1948, which many people, including me, would see that as a fulfillment of prophecy. that nation would come back together. But that nation, Israel today, is not perfect Israel, is it? It's mostly a secular nation. It's mostly a Jewish in descent nation. But it's not a nation that follows Jesus Christ. And so we read in the book of Romans in the New Testament about God's plan, how it unfolds. In Romans chapter 9 through 12, particularly, we read about it. All through Romans, we read about this. But we read about how God has moved into the New Testament phase of things. There's sort of a new era, a new dispensation, some would call it, where God is now working not specifically so much through that nation Israel, but he tells us that the nation Israel has rejected the Messiah that he brought up from that nation, Jesus Christ. Jesus was born among the Jewish people, and yet we see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all through the New Testament, that largely that nation rejected him. Now, not all of that nation rejected him. The 12 apostles, including John, who was given this revelation, did not reject him. They accepted him as the Christ. And others followed him as the Christ. And the first members of what we would now call the church, those who followed Christ in the New Testament, they were Jewish people. That's where it started. We were just reading in our Discover Calvary class today, Acts chapter 1, verse 8, which gives the assignment to this new thing called the church, the followers of Christ, and says, I want you to go and take this message starting in Jerusalem, because that's where they all were, basically. And then I want you to go to Judea, which is the surrounding region around Jerusalem. And I want you to go to Samaria, which was sort of a foreign nation blended of Jewish people and others who were not of the Jewish people, and they were considered enemies. I want you to go to them, and I want you to go to the ends of the earth. And we see that start to happen all the way through Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. And then we see it continue as we read the letters. We see that message continued even to a place today that we know as America that they don't even know existed when they read that. God knew it. God created this land along with all lands and all peoples. But they didn't know that. But he told them, your mission is to go, starting where you are. Starting with this tiny group of Jewish people in Jerusalem. But expanding on and reaching other nations and other peoples. And we read in the book of Romans particularly about how God now has grafted those people in. Those people are Gentiles. Who are Gentiles? Gentiles are everybody other than the Jews. Okay? Everybody that's not one of those nation of Israel people by descent, by ethnicity. Everybody else is considered a Gentile. And they were not really to associate with those people. Many of those people are us people. They were not to associate with them so much in the Old Testament. They did. They were disobedient. But they weren't supposed to. They were supposed to be an example of people who were chosen by God and followed God and did not mix with the Gentile people. And now, in New Testament times, now they are. Now they are. And so we read about that. And then particularly in Romans 9 through 12, and obviously we can't read 3 chapters, 9, 10, 11, 4 chapters of Romans today. But that tells us that the Jewish people generally rejected Christ. And he became like a stumbling block to them. He is the foundation. He is the cornerstone of everything for those who believe. The Jewish people in the Old Testament looked forward to a Messiah. Jesus is that Messiah. And yet when he came, they mostly rejected him. They crucified him on a cross. We all did that, but they were the specific people. The Romans were not Jewish people, and they were part of that. You and I were not there, but our sin was a part of that. And so they rejected Christ. And so he was crucified. And so he says, now I am moving on. And now mostly Gentiles are those people who are going to follow Christ. And so we're in this new time in New Testament times. And so as you read chapters 9 through 12, and as you read Romans, you'll see that God has largely moved on from that special relationship with Israel, but he never totally gives up on it. They're described in the Old Testament as being like Christ's bride. And when they are unfaithful to him, they are described as committing adultery because they don't follow him. They don't obey him. They are unfaithful to him. And so he describes it as like spiritual adultery. Interestingly, in the New Testament, he refers to the church as his bride. And so what we get from that is the people of God are like the bride of God. And so there's a covenant between him and Israel. There's a covenant between him and the church. Romans tells us that we are grafted into that covenant. Those who were not born into that nation are grafted into that covenant. So it's like he doesn't go away totally from that covenant, but they've broken it. And so largely those people who are grafted in are his focus, his concentration now. But in the time of Revelation, what I see is that those people are now going to be his focus again. Because he is seeing this vision, John is, of this thing that happens in heaven that represents these things that are happening on earth during the time of Revelation, as well as other times, because it has more than one meaning. And we see that Israel is still being loved by God, because he's talking about Jacob, and he's talking about Rachel, and he's talking about those 12 tribes again. So some people will tell you that that has nothing to do with Israel as in Old Testament Israel. It now just has to do with the church, because the church has replaced Israel. I don't believe that. Because why is he talking about Jacob and Rachel and those 12 stars? See, I think Israel was unfaithful to God, but God still loves Israel. And if he's describing things that are going on in chapter 12 of Revelation, and if we believe in a rapture, and I've told you that I do, not everybody believes the way I believe, but what have we said? By the time we get to chapter 4 or 5, somewhere in there in Revelation, the church has been raptured. And so if he's describing things that are happening during this time of Revelation, then he is describing things that are happening with the people who are there, and that's not technically the church. It's the people of God, but the church has been raptured. And so who are those people? I've told you from the beginning that people are still getting saved. So when God is sending all these plagues, all the hail and the locusts and the blood and the stars that have crashed and all these heavenly crazy things that we've read about so far and are going to continue to read about, why is he doing that? He's doing that just like he did in Egypt when he did the plagues. He's doing that to give people an opportunity to believe. And so those who are left, and the church is not left, I believe, are coming to him when they see that. Some of them are. Not all of them, but a remnant of them are coming to him. And I believe those are primarily the people of Israel. They're now turning back to him. All right? And so here's what I would say when you look at that vision. when you look at that woman who represents Israel, what are you looking at? Well, you're looking at the past, because what happened in the past? You're looking at the present, because what happened in the present, and you're looking at the future. You're looking at the time of Revelation, because what has happened during all of those eras? The same thing that we see in this vision. Let's go to the next part of it, and then we'll talk a little more about that. It brings us to the next sign, the dragon. The dragon. Verse 3, then another sign appeared in heaven. There was a great fiery red dragon. Is dragon a scary thing or a fun thing? It's a scary thing, right? It's a scary thing. So it's represented as a dragon. If it's fiery red, what does that indicate? Fire is dangerous. Red is the color of blood. It causes blood and it causes danger. And it's a dragon, which in itself is scary. It has 7 heads and 10 horns. On its head were 7 crowns. It's got a lot of power. It's got a lot of dangerous things sticking out of it. And its tail swept away, it says in verse 4, 1/3 of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth. We've seen this picture of this woman, who he said represents who? Israel. And she is about to give birth. Something great's going to happen on this nation of Israel that's remaining. Okay, they're about to be born again, if you want to put it that way. But the dragon stands in front of her as she's about to give birth, so that when she does give birth, he might devour her child. Right? What has happened throughout history? What has happened when God tried to do something good throughout history? Ever since the fall of Satan, God has tried to do something good, and Satan has responded by trying to do something evil, by trying to devour the good that God was doing. Go back, and we've talked about this a little bit. Remember how we've talked about how Satan has angels? We've seen some of those angels released, and we've seen them given some power as we've gone through the book of Revelation. And we looked back and we found that what? At some point before the Garden of Eden, Satan was the most beautiful angel. And yet Satan had the spirit of rebellion and rebelled against God and took down how many of the angels with him? How many of them joined him in his rebellion? We saw that he took 1/3. He just mentioned about 1/3, right? 1/3 of the angels. Okay, that happened in history. God was doing something good. God was reigning. Everything was good. Everything was perfect. And yet, 1/3 of the angels went down. Satan took them with him. Then God created the man and the woman. And in their infancy, Satan was there, ready to pounce on them, to deceive them about what God has done and to lead them into evil. And as a result, we live in a fallen world, right? Then, when God sent Joseph to save these chosen people, to put him in power in Egypt, later on there would come Moses when it was time for the people to be let go from Israel, and Moses went to the Pharaoh and said what? Let my people go. And as God was about to do a good thing to those people of his and let them out of slavery in Egypt, what did the Pharaoh do? He tried to kill them. God sent the plagues. God sent these plagues over and over. And finally, The Pharaoh relents and says, okay, Moses, you and your people can go. And then they leave, and what happens? Pharaoh's army chases them. God opens up the Red Sea. They go between the opening in the Red Sea, and then Pharaoh sends his soldiers after them, and God defeats them, right? But he tries to kill Israel. Then Jesus comes in New Testament times. And Jesus is about to be born. And you remember the wise men come to the ruler, Herod, and they say, what? We're here to worship the new king. Can you tell us where he is? And Herod says, new king? And he's threatened by that, and he kills all those babies who are under 2 years of age, because it's been about 2 years since Jesus was born. Now that Herod knows about that, he tries to kill them, kind of like he's there waiting for the childbirth, trying to respond to God's good, God's rescue of his people by killing him, like this vision. And then, in this time of revelation, God is doing something good again. God is working through his people again. And who is there? The Roman Empire, trying to kill God's people. We read about all these people being killed and martyred, and all those around the altar who are crying out for the martyrs to be avenged by God. We've read about all that. And so time after time after time, past, present, and future, God is doing good for his people. And Satan is there. That beast is Satan. That beast is Satan. And that beast has taken different forms over the years. Past, present, future. All represented in this vision. This great fiery red dragon with the 7 heads and the 10 horns and the 7 crowns that's so powerful. Its tail sweeping away a third of the stars in heaven and hurling them to earth. And this dragon is in front of this woman who's giving birth to this new Israel. And he wants to devour her. Chapter 12, verse 9, which we'll get to next week, specifically says that this beast is Satan. This beast represents Satan. But really, he's come in different forms, past, present, and future. He is out to destroy the people of God. Now as Jesus is preparing to return, Satan and his forces are still there. This beast represents them. Still opposing, still fighting, still accusing, still tempting. Then finally we get to the next big character. I hesitate to call them characters because it sounds like I'm saying there's something not real. But these are real. In this vision, in this sign, in this symbol, verses 5 and 6. This woman gave birth to a son, a male who is going to rule all nations with an iron rod. All right, who is this son? Who is going to rule the nations with an iron rod? I'll give you a hint. The first time he came as a humble servant and as a lamb. But the next time he comes, he's going to come to rule and to reign with an iron rod. Who could that be? Only one. Jesus, that's right. Jesus is the Son. Jesus is the Son. She gave birth to a son. The one that Satan, the beast, is there trying to kill before he can do what he's going to do. Before that can happen, her child was caught up to God. Satan's just like, but can't get the son. He comes up empty. The child was caught up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God to be nourished there for 1,260 days. Somebody's already done the math. How long is that? 1,260 days. How many years? 3.5, right? 3.5. Somebody check my math on that, but it's about 3.5 years. All right? We are in the Great Tribulation. The tribulation is 7 years. Some people call all of that the Great Tribulation. Some call just the second half of that the Great Tribulation. There have always been tribulations and trials, but this is the tribulation and now the Great Tribulation. The second half of that 7-year time after the church is raptured is how I look at that. Again, not everybody has that same view. I acknowledge that. And I acknowledge the fact that I could be wrong. Like I've told you, I could be wrong, but I'm not, but I could be. Because I don't know everything. But I'm giving you my best of what I believe this means, okay? And so this is the one and only Son. This is Jesus. He's there to save that remnant who will return to him, which I believe is mostly the people of Israel. Old Israel, yes, but kind of new Israel too. God still has that covenant. God has not forgotten about those people who were unfaithful to him. Now, does that mean only Jewish, Israeli, Abrahamic people are going to be saved during that time? No. Just like right now, we're in a time where mostly Gentiles are being saved, right? The emphasis shifted in the New Testament to the Gentiles. But are there Jewish people being saved now? Absolutely. God wants all people to come to him. So during that time, there could certainly be people who are not Jewish people who are being saved, but the majority of people who are being saved, I believe, are the Jewish people. So he is keeping his covenant with those people even after his people have been unfaithful to him. Big picture, what do we get from this other than a view of the future? God is always sovereign. Always. He was sovereign before creation. He knew that Satan would do what Satan was going to do. But God was still sovereign. God used all those things that happened for his glory. He always has a plan, and it will always come to fruition. There will always be opposition to that plan. But his plan will come to fruition. By the time we get to the end of this book, there will be no more opposition. But there still is at this point in Revelation. Then there's going to be the time when Satan's locked up. Then he's going to get out one more time. So there's still going to be some opposition. Then it's over forever. All right? There's no more opposition at that point. Satan and his forces are always going to oppose God until they don't. And God will decide when that is. God will always protect. God always has a people, the people of God, the people of Israel, the church, those who turn to him in the end times. God's people are always going to be protected. All right? So if all those things are true, who do you want to be? That's the only question that, I know I sound like a broken record every week, but that's the only question is, whose side do you want to take? Do you want to be on the side that's always fighting against God? You and I have a human nature that's broken, that is rebellious toward God. And yet we know deep inside that there is a God. And we always want to rebel because we have that part of our nature ever since the fall of mankind. So the question is, which of my natures do I want to follow? Do I want to follow my human nature, my sin nature, or do I want to allow Jesus to come into me? Do I want to allow the Holy Spirit to come into me? Do I want to be a follower of God and be on the right side in the end? In the end, it's coming. Whether you're alive for this time in Revelation or whether you and I don't make it to this afternoon, the end is coming for all of us. Which side do you want to take?